I still have the earrings I wore that night. I don't wear them anymore. I just keep them in a drawer, and every so often, I open it by accident, and my stomach drops all over again. Because those earrings were on my ears, the exact moment my husband raised his hand and hit me, in front of 200 people. And if you stay with me through this story, I promise you, by the end, you'll understand why I don't regret a single second of what happened after. My name is Delphine Ashworth. I'm 29. And 3 years ago, I thought I had built a life. I was wrong about almost all of it. That evening, I remember standing in front of my closet for nearly an hour, trying to find something that said I belong here, without saying it too loudly. I finally picked a deep emerald gown, simple, expensive looking, without trying too hard. I curled my hair until my arm ached. I practiced 3 different versions of small talk in the bathroom mirror before I left the house. And the whole drive over, I kept whispering to myself, just survive tonight. You've done this before. You can do it again. It was my mother-in-law's birthday celebration. Genevieve Wraithmoor didn't just throw parties, she staged productions. Her family had old shipping money, the kind that built half the harbor our town sat on, and every year she rented out the entire vineyard estate her late husband had left her, and invited anyone who mattered, or anyone she wanted to remind that they didn't quite matter as much as she did. Investors. Council members. Cousins twice removed who only showed up for the open bar. I had been standing at the edge of these rooms for 5 years, ever since I married her son, Julian. 5 years of laughing at jokes that weren't funny. 5 years of being looked at like fog on a window, something you see through, not someone you see. But that night, Genevieve wasn't in the mood to be subtle anymore. It started small, the way these things always do. We barely finished the first course when she made a comment about the floral arrangements, how thrown together they looked, glancing my way just long enough for the whole table to understand who she meant, since I was the one who'd offered to help plan them. I didn't say anything. I just looked down at my plate and let the moment pass. Then, over the second course, she leaned toward the mayor's wife, seated a few chairs down, and started talking, loud enough to carry, about how she'd always pictured Julian ending up with someone who understood their world, someone with real roots, someone who knew what it meant to hold a family name with dignity. She never said my name. She didn't need to. Every head at that end of the table turned toward me for exactly 1 second, then flicked away like they'd touched something hot. My face burned. Julian shifted in his seat beside me and reached for his wine. He said nothing. I said nothing. It was the third moment that finally cracked something open in me. We'd moved out onto the terrace for dessert, string lights overhead, the sound of a string quartet drifting somewhere behind us. Genevieve was holding court near the edge of the fountain, a cluster of her oldest friends gathered around her like she was telling a story they'd all wanted to hear. I was walking past when her voice rose, just enough to reach me. She was talking about Julian's promotion, his future, the Wraithmoor name and everything it was owed. And then, in that soft, poisonous voice some people reserve for their cruelest lines, she said the only thing missing from her son's life was a wife who actually deserved to stand beside him. I stopped walking. For the first time in 5 years, I turned around and I spoke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't plan a scene. I walked straight up to her, and in a voice that came out far steadier than I felt, I told her that I had spent 5 years trying to earn a place in her family, and maybe the truth was, I was never the problem. Maybe belonging was never actually on the table. The terrace didn't go silent right away. It took a beat, like the way thunder always lags behind the lightning. And in that beat, before Genevieve could even open her mouth, Julian was suddenly right beside me. I felt it before I understood it. The sound of his hand against my cheek cracked across that whole terrace. 200 people. Glasses halfway to mouths. Every conversation sliced clean in half. My own husband, in front of everyone his family had ever wanted to impress, had struck me. Nobody moved. I stood there, my palms slowly rising to my face, and it wasn't even the sting that broke me. It was the cold, hollow realization underneath it, that the one person who was supposed to stand between me and the world had instead handed me over to it, without even blinking. I didn't cry out there. I turned, walked back through the estate, out past the front gate, and once I was alone on the gravel drive, I called the one person I knew would come without asking a single question. "Mom," I said. "I need you." She was there in 40 minutes. I know because I counted every single one of them, sitting on the cold stone steps in my emerald gown, arms wrapped around myself, watching my breath fog in the night air. Counting minutes was the only thing keeping me from falling apart completely. My mother, Adeline Voss, was 58. She'd raised me on her own after my father left when I was 11, worked double shifts at a hospital laundry for most of my childhood, and never once let me see her break. She had this quiet, unshakable steadiness, the kind you don't notice until the ground starts moving, and you realize she's the only thing still solid. She pulled up, stepped out of her old blue sedan without rushing, looked at my face once, and sat down beside me on those steps like she had all the time in the world. She didn't ask what happened. She already knew, just from the sound of my voice on the phone. She wrapped her arm around me, and that's when I finally let myself cry, quietly, the kind of crying that only comes when you've been carrying something alone for far too long, and somebody finally takes some of the weight off your back. After a few minutes, she asked me one question. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What did he do?" She asked, "Do you want this to end?" I said yes. She nodded once, the way she always did when a decision had been made and there was nothing left to discuss. Then she stood, smoothed down her coat, and walked back through those gates like she'd been on the guest list all along. I followed her. The party hadn't recovered. Conversations had restarted, but they sounded hollow, brittle, everyone's eyes drifting toward the exits. Julian was near the bar with his cousin, talking low. Genevieve had composed herself again by the fountain, performing calm the way she always did. My mother walked straight toward her. I stayed close enough to hear it all. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make a speech. She stood in front of Genevieve Wraithmoor, in front of her vineyard, and her string quartet, and her 200 guests, and she spoke just quietly enough that only the people closest could hear. But what she said traveled across that terrace the way truth always does, faster than sound, carried on the faces of everyone who'd just watched it happen. She told Genevieve that she had watched her daughter spend 5 years trying to earn a seat at a table where she'd already been quietly uninvited. She told her that a woman who raises a son to strike his wife in public hasn't built a legacy, she's built a lie with good lighting. And she told her that whatever weight the Wraithmoor name carried in that garden, it would never again be mine to carry. Then she turned to Julian. Julian, who still hadn't moved from the bar. Julian, who had watched his mother-in-law walk in and hadn't crossed the terrace once, not to apologize, not to check on me, not to do anything at all. My mother looked at him for a long moment, the way you look at something you once believed was precious and have now finally seen clearly. She told him, simply, without any theatrics, that she hoped he understood exactly what he'd thrown away that night, and that no apology he ever came up with would be enough, because the second he chose that moment, He told everyone in that garden exactly who he really was. And who he was, she said, had never been worthy of her daughter. The silence that followed was different from the first one. That first silence had been shock. This one was heavier, the kind that settles in after people are finally forced to see the truth, and can't unsee it. Genevieve said nothing. For maybe the first time in her life, she had absolutely nothing to say. I filed for divorce that Monday morning. My lawyer, a woman named Priya Kellerman who had a reputation for being terrifyingly efficient, had the paperwork filed and served within the week. Julian didn't fight it, not really. I think somewhere underneath all his pride and everything his mother had trained into him, even he knew. He'd made his choice in front of 200 witnesses, and there was no charm left in the world that could undo it. What happened next, I never saw coming. Some of the guests from that night, people with long business ties to the Wraithmoor family, started quietly stepping back. Nothing dramatic, nothing public. A dropped contract here, a cancelled partnership there. The kind of slow erosion that never makes the news, but hollows out an empire from the inside, one polite excuse at a time. Julian's sister called me 2 months later, not to apologize, just to ask, with barely hidden panic in her voice, what I was planning to say publicly. I told her I wasn't planning to say anything at all. I didn't need to. The truth, once 200 people watch it happen, has a way of moving on its own. Genevieve's annual birthday gala, the one she'd hosted every single year for almost 2 decades, the highlight of her entire social calendar, simply didn't happen the following year. No announcement. No explanation. The invitations never went out. The vineyard sat quiet. The Wraithmoor name, polished for so long, had a crack in it now that no amount of entertaining could hide. My mother never once talked about that night like she'd done anything extraordinary. When I thanked her weeks later over tea in her kitchen, she looked almost confused by it. She said she'd simply told the truth to the people who needed to hear it, and the only strange part was that it had taken this long for someone to finally say it out loud. That spring, I moved into a small apartment with tall windows and nobody's name on the lease but mine. I put a single pot of rosemary on the windowsill, because it was hardy, and because it smelled like something starting over. On my first morning there, I lay in bed for a long time, just listening to the quiet, and I realized, for the first time in 5 years, nothing in my body was bracing for what might happen next. I was Delphine Ashworth. I was 29 years old. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I was finally, completely free.